Morning sunlight slid through the cracks of the mud brick house. The smell of maize porridge filled the air, and the chickens pecked near the doorway. Amahle moved slowly across the room, sweeping the dust as she hummed an old song her mother used to sing. Her son Themba sat at the table, tying his shoes, and his wife Lindy stood in front of the mirror, fastening her earrings. It was an ordinary morning until it was not. Lindy turned to her jewelry box, her hands graceful and quick. Then she froze. Her voice changed. The thin gold bracelet with the red stone was gone. She stared at the empty spot for a long time before speaking. Her words were sharp and small, like broken glass. "It was here last night." Amahle looked up from her sweeping. "Perhaps it rolled under the bed, my child. We will find it together." But Lindy stepped back as if Amel's shadow could stain her. She said softly, but with poison underneath, "You were the only one home when I left." Themba looked between the two women, his eyes uncertain, his lips pressed tight. "Mother, did you see it?" Amahle felt her throat dry. She said, "I did not. I touch only what belongs to me." But the air in the room had already chosen sides. They searched every corner, lifting mats and shaking blankets. The bracelet did not appear. By noon, whispers had already begun outside. Neighbors said the old lose their sense of what is theirs and what is not. Others said hunger can make even gentle hands reach too far. Lindy began to cry, not loudly, but enough to make her husband restless. She said, "I cannot stay under a roof where I must hide my things." Themba placed his hands on his head. He said maybe mother should stay with Aunt Zanelle for a while until this cools down. Amahle stood silent, her broom still in her hand. She looked at the faces she had raised with food and prayer. She said quietly, "You doubt my hands, but not my love. Keep your gold, I will keep my peace." She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, took her old bag and stepped into the street. The door closed behind her, slow and final. She did not cry, but as she walked away the wind carried dust that clung to her feet like memory, refusing to let go. Amahle walked for miles before the road turned to red dust. The sun hung low behind her, like a watchful eye. Her feet ached, and her breath came in short, quiet bursts. By the time she reached the next village, the smell of evening fires had begun to fill the air. Children stopped playing when they saw her. A stranger with a torn shawl and a tired face always carried stories, and not all stories were welcome. One of them ran inside, shouting, "A new woman has come alone." Soon, doors opened and curious eyes followed her slow steps. Amahle went straight to the small chapel at the edge of the fields. The pastor, a kind old man named Samuel, came out wiping his hands on a cloth. He asked where she came from. She said softly, "From a home that no longer remembers me." He looked at her face and said, "You can rest here for tonight." He gave her a corner in the back room where spare chairs and hymn books were kept. That night she lay on a woven mat, staring at the wooden ceiling. The air smelled of candle wax and maize bread. Outside frogs sang and a donkey cried somewhere far off. Amahle whispered, "I did not steal anything, only peace was taken from me." In the morning she helped sweep the chapel floor before the first prayer. The women who came to clean looked at her with polite smiles, but kept their distance. One whispered to another, "She came alone, maybe she is running from trouble." Amahle heard them but said nothing. She had learned that silence can be stronger than any defense. Later she sat by the well, washing her hands. A young girl offered her water and asked, "Are you someone's grandmother?" Amahle smiled. "Perhaps, somewhere." The girl laughed, then ran away before her mother could scold her for talking to strangers. As the sun dipped again, Pastor Samuel brought her a small loaf of bread and said, "The village is cautious, but hearts soften with time." Amahle thanked him, breaking the bread in half. Half for hunger, half for hope. She watched the horizon turn gold and thought, even the sky changes color to survive another day. Days passed slowly in the small village. Amahle swept the chapel each morning and helped fetch water from the well. She never asked for anything and never complained. When it rained, she stood outside with her palms open, as if greeting an old friend. The children began to wave when she passed by, though their mothers still whispered behind their hands. One afternoon she noticed an old woman struggling to carry a basket of cassava roots up the hill. Amahle put down her broom and went to help her. The woman's name was Busi. At first she hesitated, but Amahle smiled and said, We both have more years behind us than ahead. Let us carry what we can together. They shared the weight, laughing quietly at their own tiredness. By the time they reached Busy's hut, a small friendship had already begun. Inside the hut, Amahle saw a broken stool and a torn curtain. She asked if she could mend them. Busy nodded, surprised. That evening, Amahle sat near the fire, sewing the fabric with steady hands. Her stitches were small, and even the kind made by habit and patience. Busy said, "Your hands know how to make silence look beautiful." Amahle answered, "They have had much practice." Word began to travel. Soon other women brought old dresses, torn bags, and ripped blankets. Amahle repaired them all and refused payment. She said, "I only want my hands to stay useful." But people began leaving small gifts anyway: maize, soap, candles. Even the children brought little things they could spare. The chapel that once held her in silence, now filled with the hum of voices calling her name. Pastor Samuel smiled one morning and said, "It seems you have built a home without walls." Amahle looked at the women around her and said, "Walls are only for keeping things, hearts are for keeping people." One evening, a young girl whose mother had once whispered against her brought Amahle a basket of oranges. She said, "My mother says you sew blessings into cloth." Amahle touched her cheek and said, "I only fix what the world tears." The girl smiled, then hugged her quickly before running away. That night, Amahle sat by the chapel window. The stars blinked above like tiny stitches in the sky. She whispered, "I am still here, and maybe that is enough." The morning was clear after a night of rain. The smell of wet soil and smoke drifted through the village. Amahle sat near the chapel doorway, mending a child's torn school shirt. The fabric was thin and frayed, but her needle moved steady. Each stitch carried a quiet prayer for the hands that would wear it. Busy came running up the path holding a folded envelope. Her breath came in bursts. "Amahle," she said, "someone left this for you at the trading post. It has your name written on it." Amahle wiped her hands on her shawl and took the paper. The ink on the front was faded but familiar. She turned the letter over slowly, afraid of what it might say. The paper smelled of dust and long travel. Her eyes moved across the words. Each line felt heavier than the last. It was from her son Themba. He wrote that the missing bracelet had been found. It had fallen behind the bed frame and been discovered when the furniture was moved. He wrote that Lindy cried and that he had been ashamed. He begged his mother to come home. He said, "Forgive me, I doubted the one who gave me life." Amahle folded the paper carefully. Her eyes stayed dry, but her chest ached. Busy said, "You will go back." Amahle looked toward the sky, pale blue after rain. She said, "I do not know, the heart remembers, but it also fears." All day the letter stayed in her pocket. The villagers noticed her silence, but said nothing. That evening, when the sun dipped low, Pastor Samuel came to sit beside her. He asked softly, "What weighs your spirit tonight?" Amahle handed him the letter. He read it, and then placed his hand over hers. He said, "Forgiveness is not a road, it is a bridge. You only need to take the first step." Amahle stared at the horizon, where the hills met the sky. The air was full of the sound of insects and children playing in the distance. She whispered, "Even when love forgets you, it still leaves a light to find your way home." That night she did not sleep. She sat by the candle and held the letter close. Outside, the rain began again, soft, forgiving, like a promise. Morning light crept slowly across the fields. Amahle stood at the edge of the village, rode with her small cloth bag, and the letter folded neatly inside it. The birds were loud that day, as if trying to speak for her silence. Pastor Samuel walked beside her for a while, then stopped near the chapel gate. He said softly, "The road home is long, but the road away from love is longer." Amahle nodded, her eyes on the horizon. The villagers gathered to say goodbye. Busy held her hand and whispered, "Come back. Whenever you wish, this village will always keep a place for you." Children waved and one little girl shouted, "Do not forget us." Amahle laughed gently and said, "I forget only sorrow." Then she began walking. The path was red and wide. Each step brought memories she thought she had buried. Her son's laughter as a child, the smell of her kitchen, the sound of her husband's radio playing old songs on Sunday mornings. They walked with her like invisible companions. By noon the sun was high. She rested under a baobab tree and opened the letter again. The paper had softened from her touch. She read her son's words over and over until they sounded like prayer. She wondered if he had truly changed or if guilt only wore kindness for a short time. She closed her eyes and whispered, I am coming, not for apology, but for peace. That night, she stayed at a small roadside inn. The woman who owned it offered her a blanket and soup. She asked where Amahle was going. Amahle said home, or at least the place that used to be home. The woman nodded with understanding. She said sometimes home is not a place, it is the people waiting when you arrive. Amahle smiled yes, and sometimes it is the people who once turned you away. When the morning came, the sky was clear and full of birds. Amahle felt a strange calm inside her, the kind that comes when a wound decides to stop bleeding. She adjusted her shawl and began the last stretch of the journey. The closer she came to the town, the more her heart trembled. But her steps did not stop, she whispered to herself. Courage is not loud, it is the sound of feet that keep moving toward forgiveness. By the time Amahle reached her old street, the sky had turned pale and soft. Every step felt heavier, as if the road itself remembered her leaving. Children played near the fence, but when they saw her they stopped and stared. The smell of cooked maize drifted from a house 2 doors away. Everything looked the same, but the air was different. She stopped in front of the house she had built with her husband long ago. The paint had faded, but the window she once polished every morning still caught the light. Her fingers shook as she raised her hand to knock. For a moment she almost turned away. Then she whispered to herself, the truth does not hide forever. The door opened slowly. It was not her son who stood there. It was Lindy. For a second, both women said nothing. Lindy's eyes widened, her mouth opened, then closed again. Amahle looked at her quietly, no anger, no tears, only calm tiredness. Lindy spoke first, her voice low. We found it, the bracelet, it was behind the bed. Amahle nodded, I know, I received the letter. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of wet dust and mango trees. Lindy looked down at her hands. She said, I was wrong, I let my fear speak for me. Amahle answered, fear is a loud thing, but guilt can whisper for years. Then the door creaked wider, and her son appeared behind his wife. Themba's eyes filled with water. He stepped forward but stopped just short of touching her. He said, Ma, come in please. Amahle looked past him into the room, her chair was still in the corner. Her old blanket folded on it, but she did not move. She said, this house forgot me once. I do not know if my heart is ready to remember it again. Lindy began to cry. Amahle reached out, not to comfort, but to remind. She said, forgiveness is not for the one who hurt, it is for the one who wants to breathe again. She placed her hand on the doorframe and whispered, this wood remembers more than you think. Then she stepped inside slowly. The house felt smaller than before, but warmer. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like peace learning how to speak again. The evening light poured into the house like liquid gold. Amahle stood in the center of the small room that once held her laughter and her tears. Nothing had changed. The old woven mat still lay near the bed. Her husband's photograph hung crooked on the wall. But in that stillness, everything felt different. Time had walked through these walls, leaving behind silence instead of dust. Lindy brought her a chair and said softly, please sit, Mama. Amahle nodded and sat slowly, her knees stiff from the long road. Themba stood nearby, his hands trembling like a boy again. He looked down, ashamed to meet her eyes. He said, I kept hearing your voice in my sleep. You said, my son, doubt breaks faster than hunger. Amahle smiled faintly. I never said it out loud, but maybe the wind carried it for me. Lindy came closer and knelt beside her. Her voice broke as she spoke. I am sorry, Mama, for what I said, for what I believed. Amahle touched her head gently. Child, the tongue is quick, but the heart must learn to move slower. For a while, the house was filled with the sound of small breaths, the kind that come after a storm. Themba moved forward and knelt at her feet. He pressed his forehead against her hands. He whispered, forgive me. Amahle looked down at him, her only child. The boy she had held when fever took his breath. The boy who now carried the weight of his own sin. She said softly, forgiveness is not given once. It must be chosen each morning. Tears fell onto her hands, warm and heavy. Amahle closed her eyes and let them stay there, as if washing away the dust of all the years between them. After a moment, she lifted his chin. My son, the world can take everything from us. Money, comfort, even names, but it cannot take the chance to begin again. Lindy brought her a small bowl of soup. They sat together, eating in silence. Outside, the crickets began to sing, and for the first time in a long time, their song didn't sound lonely. It sounded like a prayer being answered slowly. Amahle looked at her son and whispered, "The bracelet was never the treasure. The treasure was learning that love survives even when it is broken." That night she slept in her old room again. But this time, the house did not forget her. The first light of morning slid through the thin curtains and painted the walls in gold and gray. Amahle woke before the rooster called, her habit of early rising never leaving her. She sat by the window, watching the mist drift through the street like old memories returning home. Her son and Lindy still slept in the next room. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way that felt fragile, like glass that could break with a single wrong word. She made tea and stepped outside. The wooden chair still stood where she had left it years ago. She sat down, wrapped her shawl tight, and listened to the sounds of the village waking. A woman carrying a basket passed by and smiled shyly. An old man from across the road raised his hand in greeting. For the first time in years, people looked at Amahle without whispers behind their smiles. She sipped her tea slowly. The warmth traveled through her hands, and she thought, peace is not a gift. It is something you learn to hold without trembling. Then she saw him. A man walking slowly up the dusty road, carrying a leather bag over his shoulder. His clothes were clean but worn, his hair touched with gray. When he came closer, Amahle froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Mandla, her husband's younger brother, the one who had left after the funeral years ago and never returned. He stopped a few steps away, hat in hand, eyes heavy with something deeper than guilt. Amahle stood, her heart thudding like a drum. Mandla said softly, "I heard what happened, sister. But I came for something else. Before our brother died, he left something with me. He said one day you would need it more than gold." He opened his bag and took out a small wooden box. The edges were worn smooth with time. Inside lay an old photograph, Amahle, her husband, and a young Themba smiling beside them. Next to it was a folded piece of paper with faded ink. Amahle took it slowly. Her husband's handwriting looked like a whisper from another world. She read the first line aloud. "If this reaches you, my Amahle, remember that love does not die, it only waits for us to be ready again." Tears filled her eyes, but her lips curved into a smile. Mandla said quietly, "He wanted you to build again when the world feels small." Amahle looked toward the morning light. Then she said, "Tell him I did." The sun rose fully then, spilling light across the yard. And for the first time in many years, Amahle felt the house breathe again, as if even the walls had forgiven. The day grew quiet after Mandla left. Amahle sat inside the small house, the wooden box resting on her lap. The letter lay folded beside it, and for a long time, she couldn't bring herself to open it again. She traced her husband's handwriting with trembling fingers. The same hand that had once held hers through storms, births, and funerals. Now those words were all that was left of him. Yet somehow they felt alive. She finally unfolded the paper carefully, afraid that even her breath might tear it. The ink was faded, the paper thin, but every word felt heavy as stone. Greater than, "My Amahle, if this reaches you, it means I am gone before my promises were kept. You always said that a home is not the roof or the walls, but the hands that build it. If our son forgets, remind him gently. If the world turns its back, keep walking forward. You are the fire I leave behind, the kind that warms, not burns. When the water rises, do not fear, you were born to survive it. And when you feel alone, remember, love waits like the dawn, it always comes back." Amahle's lips trembled as she read each line. The room seemed to breathe with her, the air warm and heavy. She felt her husband's presence as if he stood right there, smiling the way he used to after a long day's work. The sound of his laughter echoed softly in her memory, and for a brief moment, the years between them disappeared. Tears fell, not from grief but from gratitude. She whispered, "You always knew I would forget how strong I am." She placed the letter back in the box, then stood and looked around her old home. It was still worn, still cracked, but now it felt alive again. That afternoon, she walked to the chapel and told Pastor Samuel, I want to teach the women here what my hands remember. He smiled. Then you will give this village something the storms can never take. Amahle began to gather scraps of cloth, old needles, and thread from anyone who would help. By sunset, she sat under the mango tree with 3 women and 2 little girls, teaching them how to sew torn fabric back together. As she worked, she thought of her husband's words. Yes, love had waited, and now it was time to build again. The next morning, the smell of wet earth and smoke filled the air. Amahle woke early, her heart steady for the first time in years. She wrapped her faded shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The box with her husband's letter safely placed on the table near the window. The sun rose behind the chapel, soft orange light touching the fields. Under the big mango tree, 5 women were already waiting, Busey, Thandi, Zanel, and 2 younger girls holding pieces of torn cloth. When Amahle reached them, they greeted her with warm smiles. She sat on a wooden stool and said gently, "If the world tears you apart, use your hands to put yourself back together." The women listened. The younger ones giggled as they tried to thread their needles. Busey said, "You teach like a mother, Amahle." Amahle smiled and answered, "Because every woman carries the memory of her mother's hands, even when she has none left to guide her." The first few days were quiet, just the sound of thread moving through fabric, and the laughter of children running nearby. But soon, the sound became a song. More women joined, bringing scraps of old fabric, baskets, and stories they had kept buried for too long. They spoke about loss, about hunger, about love that had gone cold and come back again. Amahle never interrupted. She listened and sewed, her needle moving in rhythm with their words. Each stitch became a promise that pain could be turned into beauty if one had patience enough to finish the pattern. By the end of the week, a large quilt hung between the trees, made from all their scraps. It was uneven, colorful, and beautiful. Amahle looked at it and said softly, "This is what forgiveness looks like." When Pastor Samuel passed by, he stopped and watched the women sewing beneath the golden evening sky. He said, "You have built a new kind of house, Amahle." She looked up, smiling faintly. "A house with no walls," she said, "but one where everyone belongs." As the sun dipped low, the women sang while they worked. Amahle closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her husband's words alive in the warmth of their voices. Her house had once forgotten her, but now, she had built one that never would. The weeks passed like soft rain falling on dry ground. Under the mango tree, the sound of laughter and the hum of sewing filled the air each day. Women came from nearby villages, carrying old clothes and broken hearts. Amahle welcomed them all with a smile and warm tea. She taught them to stitch not just fabric, but courage back into their days. The colorful quilt hanging between the trees had grown larger. Every patch carried a story, a memory, a secret turned into strength. The quilt had become a landmark. Children called it the Rainbow Wall of Amahle. Even the men began to come quietly, asking her to mend torn pockets or broken dreams. One afternoon, as Amahle and the women worked the road filled with dust, a car stopped near the chapel. A man stepped out wearing clean clothes and carrying a camera. It was Themba. He stood for a moment, watching the women laugh beneath the golden light. He saw his mother surrounded by color, life, and respect. For the first time, he understood what home really meant. Amahle looked up her needle, paused midair. Their eyes met, no words, just a deep silence between 2 hearts that finally remembered each other. Themba walked forward slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he rushed it. He said softly, "Ma." Amahle placed her cloth aside and stood. "You came." He nodded, his voice breaking. "I wanted to see what you built." She led him closer, showing the quilt swaying gently in the breeze, each piece stitched by hands that once felt forgotten. Amahle said, "This is what we do here. We take what the world throws away and make it beautiful again." Themba's eyes filled with tears. "I never knew how strong you were." Amahle smiled faintly. "I was never strong, I just learned how to stand while I broke." The women gathered around quietly, their eyes soft with respect. Busey whispered, "This is her son, the one who forgot." Amahle turned and said kindly, "The one who remembered in time." That evening, Themba helped hang a new quilt square, a bright red patch embroidered with his mother's name. When the sun dipped below the hills, its light fell directly on her face. Amahle closed her eyes and whispered, "Even the sky remembers love when it sets right." That night the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. And for the first time since her husband's death, Amahle felt truly home. That night the air was cool and gentle. Amahle sat outside her house with a thin blanket over her knees. The moon hung low and wide, turning the yard silver. Inside, the sound of her son's quiet laughter mixed with the clinking of dishes. As Lindy cleaned up after dinner, Amahle looked up at the stars and smiled. They looked the same as they had the night she first left this house. The night she carried only her shawl and her pride. But now the stars did not seem far away. They looked like friends who had been waiting for her to look up again. She thought of her husband's letter, of the words, "Love waits like the dawn." She whispered, "It waited long enough, and now it shines." Her son came to the door. "Ma, come inside, it's late." She shook her head gently. "I will stay a little longer." He nodded and went back in, leaving the door open. So the light from the lantern spilled onto the ground. Amahle watched it stretch across the yard, a golden path leading straight to her feet. She picked up her needle and a piece of cloth from her basket. Even at night, she sewed by the lantern glow. Each stitch was slow and careful. She was mending a small tear in one of Thumba's shirts. Her hands moved with peace instead of pain. From the chapel hill, the sound of distant singing drifted through the wind. The women she had taught were praying, their voices soft, like the rustle of leaves. Amahle closed her eyes, listening. She whispered, "This is what it means to be remembered." When the candle burned low, she finished the last stitch and folded the shirt neatly. The light flickered but did not go out. It stayed steady and warm. Amahle looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn brushed the sky. Her voice was low but strong. "This house forgot me once, but now it remembers. And so does my heart." As the morning began, she smiled. The world had broken her many times. But now she had learned not just to survive. She had learned to shine. Morning broke softly over the village. A golden light touched the fields and slipped through the leaves of the old mango tree. Amahle stood beneath it with her basket of threads and folded cloths. The women were already waiting, their faces bright and peaceful. Today felt different, quiet but full. She smiled at them, the way the sun smiles after rain. She said, "My hands are slower now, so today you must teach me instead." The women laughed, their needles already moving in rhythm. Children ran around the tree chasing each other, their laughter ringing through the air like music. Pastor Samuel arrived with his Bible in hand and said, "The chapel needs a new curtain. Can your house with no walls help us again?" The women cheered, and Amahle nodded, of course. One more piece for the quilt of this world. She watched them cut the fabric measure and sew together. Busey hummed softly. Thandi told a story that made everyone laugh. Amahle sat back on her stool, her eyes full of the life she had rebuilt. Her heart whispered, "This is what love looks like when it learns to stay." By midday the curtain was finished, red and gold like the evening sky. The women held it up proudly, sunlight shining through it. Pastor Samuel said, "You have sewn more than cloth today. You have sown peace into this village." Amahle smiled. "That is all I ever wanted." Later, when the work was done, she walked to the chapel alone. She touched the new curtain, its edges soft beneath her fingers. The light behind it glowed like fire but gentle. She whispered, "The house forgot me once, but the world did not." Outside, her son and Lindy waited with baskets of food. Thumba said, "The women want to name the sewing place after you." Amahle laughed softly. "Names fade, but kindness stays longer." They walked home together, the sun setting behind them. The road shimmered in gold and red. When they reached the gate, Amahle turned for one last look at the chapel. She whispered, "This is home, not the walls, but the hearts inside them." That night, as she lay in bed, the wind moved through the trees like soft singing. Her husband's words returned to her again. "Love waits like the dawn, it always comes back." Amahle smiled in her sleep, and the dawn came. Years passed quietly after that golden morning. The village changed, new houses rose from the earth. Children became parents, and time softened the sharp edges of old memories. But the sound of needles and laughter still echoed beneath the mango tree. The women kept sewing, the children kept singing, and every quilt they made carried a small patch of red, the color of Amelle's shawl. Amahle grew older, her hair turned white like seafoam, her hands slower but still steady. She stopped sewing herself but never stopped guiding. She would sit near the chapel steps watching the women work. Sometimes she would smile and say, "Your stitches are too wide or your thread too short." And the women would laugh, fixing their work the way she had once fixed broken hearts. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Amahle asked Pastor Samuel to sit beside her. She said, "When I am gone, promise me the mango tree will stay." He nodded, his voice soft. "It will stay, and so will your name." She smiled. "My name is not important, just let them remember that hands can heal." That night the air was still and the stars seemed to bow low over the chapel. When the morning came, Amahle did not wait. Her face was calm, her hands folded on her chest, as if she had fallen asleep listening to the sound of sewing. The women covered her with a quilt made of every color they had, each patch a memory, each thread a prayer. The whole village gathered under the mango tree. Children held candles, the women sang softly, and even the wind stayed gentle. Pastor Samuel said she taught us how to build a home without walls, and how to forgive the sky when it forgets to rain. Themba stood quietly with tears on his face. He whispered, "My mother taught the world how to begin again." Years later, when travelers passed through the village, they saw the great mango tree and the colorful quilts swaying like flags of peace. Children would run up and tell them, "This is the place of Amahle, the woman who sewed the sky back together." And when the rain came after a long dry season, the people would look up and smile, because they said even the sky remembers her kindness.